The Middle East Mess.
I'll tell you the reason why I picked this title. This is former House Intelligence Committee Chairman Pete Hoekstra. He says, we have a Middle East that is ablaze. We now have chaos throughout Libya, radical jihadists on the doorstep of getting into Western Europe. You've got a dead American ambassador. You've got total chaos in Syria. Who knows what's going to happen in Jordan? Who knows what may happen in Turkey? And you got chaos in Iraq. Wow, what a huge mess. So I thank Pete Hoekstra, who I have met and know, for this for the title of this discourse. But anyways, that's one perspective. Just last week in the Financial Times, there was this little blurb that was sent to the editor. I realize you probably can't read all the words here, but I thought it was a pretty interesting comment. It's called The Short Guide to the Middle East, a letter to the editor from Mr. K.N. Al-Saba. Sir, Iran is backing Assad. Gulf states are against Assad. Assad is against Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood and Obama are against General Sisi. But Gulf states are pro-Sisi, which means they are against Muslim Brotherhood. Iran is pro-Hamas, but Hamas is backing Muslim Brotherhood. Obama is backing Muslim Brotherhood, yet Hamas is against the U.S. Gulf states are pro-U.S., but Turkey is with Gulf states against Assad. Yet Turkey is pro-Muslim Brotherhood against General Sisi. And General Sisi is being backed by the Gulf states. Welcome to the Middle East, and have a nice day. Well, that sort of summarizes the situation from just a worldly perspective. Of course, we come at it with a different perspective, but it does show you why this really is a Middle East mess. Now, this is an attempt from someone to put together a picture, graphics. I read you that article. Here's someone else's attempt to sort of give you a perspective, a pictorial perspective of the Middle East. Now, the red arrows that you see indicate enmity between the two connectors, and the blue arrows indicate support. And it kind of summarizes the same thing. You have a blue arrow going one way from one country to another, and a red arrow going the other way from that same country. But if you had to explain what's going on and how it all comes out, you'd have a hard time, wouldn't you? But you wouldn't have a hard time if you had our perspective on it, the biblical perspective. And that's what I hope I can bring today. I want to try to give an update on what is going on there and what is it as far as we can see in our knowledge of what's to take place around the Middle East, but especially centered in one particular area. If you look at this map, what looks odd to you on this map? Look at that little tiny red piece right there. Here you are with all this green. Of course, what is that little red piece? Israel. That's right. If I were to ask you, boy, they could sure use that land, what would you say to me? You're kind of crazy. Let me show you a perspective, a brief tour through this area, and then we'll get back to some statistics on this Middle East. Let's take a brief tour through the Middle East turmoil that was mentioned. In Jordan, we start out with King Abdullah II. King Abdullah II has an economy today that is beset, has insufficient water supplies, believe it or not, insufficient oil, and other natural resources. Not much to go with there. They're very dependent at this point on Egypt to supply the energy. And that's why you see the tone that Jordan has taken with Egypt. But they have strong support, as was mentioned in that mess that we tried to sort through, and aid from the U.S., from the U.K., and from France. Then we have Syria. Of course, the biggest news that we have. Since the Civil War, has been going on in Syria. We're a little over what now, is it a year? 2 million refugees have crossed the border. The borders that you see into Jordan and Iraq. 2 million people they've lost. Now, there's little doubt, at least that you've heard this week, unless you just totally ignore the news and you take Joe's advice and just stay away from everything. I'm just kidding, Joe. But unless you've been brain dead or asleep for the last week, you know what has happened in Syria. There's little doubt that they've used chemical weapons on the rebels there. Interesting, Bashar Assad has told the U.S. if it invades and starts a war in Syria or crosses there, expect another Vietnam. Of course, those of us that lived through the Vietnam era remember we spent a decade there and left after losing that war with nothing but a lot of lost lives. Interestingly enough, this is reintroducing, however, the conflict between the U.S. and Russia when there was a pretty good peace between us for a lot of years, but this whole issue around Syria is reintroducing this conflict. Remember that in connection with a later prophecy we'll look at in Ezekiel 38 with those that are definitely opposed to Israel. Now, we know that just last week a United Nations team went to Damascus August 19th to begin this investigation. Did they or did they not use chemical weapons? If they did, who did use it? Now, I looked just before I came in because I want to make sure that nothing happened in the news that voided my whole discourse. But today is the day when those UN fact-finding people are due to be back and present just down across the river in New York their findings. Don't expect those findings to say who did what, but it will at least say, yes, we found strong evidence that chemical weapons were used. And we know, of course, the U.S. has almost been backed into a corner on this by statements that were made that this is a red line beyond which we will not allow things to go. The Syrian economy is in dire straits. Suffering huge declines. It was down 2% in 2011 at the beginning of the revolution. But look what's happened in the last 2 years. That economy has suffered down 31%. That's negative growth. And 7% in 2013. So 40% of that economy before they started the civil war was oil, was based on oil. Now, Syria is a net oil importer. It has disrupted the entire economy of Syria. This is important because as we get farther on, I'm going to suggest something to you around the idea of those that are gathered together against Israel and how they're looking at this. So keep in mind, I'm not just presenting these economic data. There is a purpose behind it. I'd like to present a little what-if scenario, and this I appreciate in the last week or so I asked Brother Ken to send me all the stuff that he thought was interesting on Israel, and he's done that. This came out of one of them. It's something I had forgotten about. But recently, there was an Operation Orchard that was conducted by Israel. The CIA, our CIA, confirmed the destruction of a nuclear reactor by Israel in 2007. Of course, that's not something you announce on the news. Syria is not going to say, oh, by the way, Israel just took out our nuclear reactor. That was funded by North Korea, that nuclear reactor. And the U.S. has said that Israel has struck inside Syria 3 times since the Civil War began. That's something, again, remember, we're not going to hear about this because Israel doesn't want to talk about it. Syria certainly doesn't want to talk about it. But think about what if that had not been done and you've got nuclear weapons available to the Assad regime. Well, let's move on. Let's move on to Iraq. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. There are almost 2 million refugees, they said, have crossed the Syrian-Jordan border from Iraq. There's no resources, however, in those countries to provide for them, and we're seeing this fleeing and mixing of refugees all over the Middle East as both the civil wars and the other wars have been sorting out. That's a difficulty. Iraq, is still in a mess, even after the U.S. withdrew support there. Saudi Arabia, the biggest country of the whole lot. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and incidentally, this is his real name. I only have 45 minutes, so I couldn't take the time to give you his real name. It reminds me, we had an exchange student from Spain when many years ago, and the names are always added on to your parents' names, and that's what happens here. And you have a name that really, you use one name, but it's like 10 names. I like it that in the scriptures we only have to remember Peter, Paul. We don't have to know their last names. Saudi Arabia is the suspected power behind the Syrian rebels. No one has said that it was, but they're the suspected one. And they also really support the current regime in Egypt, not the rebels. Here's an interesting thing about Saudi Arabia. 50% of the population there is under 25. Now, we have a big youth population, but we don't have one that big. However, 30% of those under 25, those that are 15 to 25 that would be eligible to be employed, are unemployed. A 30% unemployment rate in the richest country in the Middle East. That tells you something about the mess and turmoil we have here. What happens with those people when they have nothing to do? This is where jihad and all the unrest comes from. Lebanon. Michael Suleiman is the current president there, an outspoken critic of Israel. Yet he opposes Hezbollah at the same time, because Hezbollah continues to threaten the overthrow of his country. Here we have a situation economically even more dire. The public debt of the country of Lebanon is 150% of GDP. That's gross domestic product. If you add up all the products that are produced in that country and the revenue that's generated from them, they have debt 150% of that number. That's number 4 in the world in a little country like this. Hassan Rouhani of Iran, he accused the Syrian rebels of being behind the suspected chemical attacks. He's the only one that has come out. He says it's not Assad, it's the rebels, of course. They're killing themselves. That makes a lot of sense. But the supreme leader there, of course, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, blamed the countries outside the Middle East for the turmoil, saying they're trying to stir up things because of the favoritism that they have towards, of course, that little tiny country in the middle, Israel. Iran economically is under tremendous pressure, mostly because of the sanctions that have come from the Western world. Keep in mind, economic sanctions are the most important tool you have in a world that's global in its nature. And that's something we think about when we think about future actions taken by many countries against this nation of Israel. There's financial restrictions that prevent them in Iran from doing business in dollars, euros, or pound sterling, the 3 most stable currencies that you have in the world. So they naturally have another economic mess. And then there's Egypt. Mohammed Morsi, who was outthrown, and General Sisi, who's the current rebel. Morsi was overthrown just July 3rd, which was the end of his term, when he refused to step down in new elections. There's been over 1,000 killed in the uprising there. Egypt has its plagues too. 13% unemployment, only 2% growth. Those two things don't harmonize. Tourism, which was 7% of GDP, has suffered very significantly during this time. So as I said, what looks odd on this map? Of course, we said the fact that all these countries that I talked about that are surrounding Israel are in dire straits. Israel, their position amongst this group of countries, it's not about their land. Here's the land of Israel. You can see in square miles, Lebanon is the only country smaller than that you see on this chart. The population of 8 million people, and now this is it's a little higher number than you will see publicized with Israel, because this is based on their projection that was made on the 1st of July of this year, projected that their population now is about just over 8 million in this area. And that's from the worldatlas.com. You can check that if you'd like. So, as you can see, here's a small country, really by most standards, one of the smaller in population. So this, again, isn't about wanting the land of Israel. It's about other things. Netanyahu himself, Prime Minister of Israel, the senior Syrian official who just a few days ago, on the 26th of August, issued the first direct warning that said if attacked, his country would retaliate against Israel. And here's what he said. Not that they retaliate against the U.S., against Israel. The region will go up in flames. That will affect security not only in the region, but across the world. They say, okay, U.S. bombs you. Why do you bomb Israel? Let's look at some of those that are at the same size. Why not bomb the Honduras? Why not bomb Austria? Why not bomb Switzerland? Why not bomb Tajikistan? They're all the same size and population. It's not about the people. It's about anti-Semitism, the hatred that exists over Israel. A biblical hatred we know that's traced back many years and has existed, especially in our modern times. Turkey's prime minister, just on almost 2 weeks ago, August 20th, accused Israel of being behind the ouster of Egypt's Islamist president, Mohamed Morsi. The only claim he had to support this was he said, well, there was a statement by this Jewish French intellectual who had a meeting with an Israeli official. So Joe and I go in the other room and we make some statement, and all of you broadcast it to the Bible students that, well, I've got this on good information because I heard Joe Miguez and Len Grice talking about it at the New York Convention. But you see the credibility that's attached to it because of the bias that exists. Zechariah 10:10 gives us a statement I think helps explain the situation. This is from the Complete Jewish Bible. That's not a translation you may know. It's available online, but I wanted to get that perspective because of some of the names that are used. It says, I will bring them back from the land of Egypt, gather them out of Asher. I will bring them into Gilead and Lebanon, our Gilead and Lebanon. And then the important point, until, and that literally means and, there is no room for them. Now that would generally mean they'd be filling up, and I think that is one of the meanings. But also it means that they would be noted as having an impact and a difference there. And the fact that that presence is there is disturbing many, many people. Let's look just what has happened in the last few years. Our global financial crisis that started in the U.S. with the mortgage-backed securities and the derivatives created a financial crisis in 2008. But you know what else it did? It made the aliyah, the migration from the Western world to Israel, the highest in 36 years. 3,324 North American Jews immigrated to Israel, highest in 36 years. Since the mid-90s, there's been a steady stream of South African Jews, American Jews, French Jews making aliyah. Interestingly enough, those who weren't, we've seen a great, enormous progress in the purchase of property in Israel by the Jewish populations in some of the Western countries. Why? Because they know the rising anti-Semitism is going to lead to great pressure, and they're getting ready to leave. I think this great aliyah will continue from what we just see in the trends. Zechariah 12:2 and 3. I want to highlight just a couple things here. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about. Now notice what's said there. All the people round about. In verse 3 it says, in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. I think it's differentiating there between the people round about, those that have talked about, those nations surrounding Israel, a cup of trembling. What happens when we're threatened? Well, we're going to attack Israel because we know that they're an ally. So it's made them fear because of the position and presence of Israel in their midst. The burdensome stone for all the people is that in many cases we see the rising anti-Semitism around the world. We don't know what to do. They'd love to have the people go in the whole area. You'll notice I didn't talk about the Palestinians here because I think in this sort of area it's irrelevant. I don't mean to say they're an irrelevant people, but I don't think it's one of the thwarts of power that you see being exerted at this particular time. It's kind of a thorn in the side that exists and a cause for people to rally behind. But Israel's been made a burdensome stone because it comes down to saying, okay, U.S., do you intervene and bring that down on Israel? That's the kind of situations that are faced when you have things like today. But then Zechariah goes on to tell us, I will strengthen the house of Yehudah and save the house of Joseph. I will bring them back in my compassion for them. Notice the underline, that's my underline. They will be as if I hadn't driven them out. That's a restoration of saying they're there in a permanent basis, not to be driven out. It'd be just as though they were never gone. The rebuilding, the replenishment of the land would be just as though they had never been left. And this is the promise that comes from, it says, for I am Adonai, their God, and I will answer them. So if you haven't placed great emphasis on looking at Israel as part of God's time plan and part of his commitment, I would just say perhaps you ought to revisit this, because we're seeing the fulfillment of these prophecies today in what we see coming out of this turmoil and mess in the Middle East. In July, the European Union issued new budget guidelines, not on dealing with the rest of the world, but on cooperation with Israel. What they said is, look, we have grants, we have prizes, we have investments, and if these are to be used, if you're giving them to Israel, remember this is the European Union now, and those that are part of the economic European Union, it must be used not in Israel, but within what they call sovereign Israeli territory. In other words, you can't put any investment in anything that's been built since 67. Because that's when they feel when Israel was attacked in 67, they captured the old city and the walls. They're saying, it's the same as saying, look, the U.S., you went in, and when you expanded to the west, you took all this land away from a people. It wasn't even a people that had it, but they were there a lot longer. And, anything you want to invest, we're not going to allow you to invest unless that, it goes back to what it was before you came into this country and made the Louisiana Purchase, for example. So what they're saying now is, just to avoid anyone misunderstanding this, Israel or Israeli institutions must explicitly conform to those rules if they want that money. Well, what would you do if you were Prime Minister Netanyahu and this happened? You were running this country. You say, oh boy, we better conform to this. Netanyahu has now made a strategic decision to act to boost trade outside of the European Union. Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Peru, all politically friendly countries that could serve as bridgeheads for increased trade with Latin America. European countries are suffering the Western enigma of declining economies. And this area of the southern hemisphere is now one of the biggest booming areas of the world. Strategically, that's an important place to go. So you can see that the Lord is still guiding them in their direction, even though they haven't turned wholly to God in their strategic forefront. Well, where do we go from here? I'm not going to be a prophet. I'm not going to try to tell you what happens, but let's look at some of the scriptures. Joel 3, 1-12. I'm just going to read the highlighted part because it talks about in those days, at the time when Israel is back in its land, the captivity, I will bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. That's bringing them back to their land. And I will gather all nations, bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat. Of course, that was where the big battle took place in the days of Sisera. Let the weak say, I am strong. Here's the key part. I've underlined this again. Assemble yourselves and come, all ye heathen. Gather yourselves together and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. If we go over to Ezekiel 38, you know that that's a long prophecy about the gathering of Gog and Magog. And I'm not going to go through all that, other than to highlight one particular phrase in that language that's used in Ezekiel 38 that describes the end time leading up to Armageddon. It's this phrase that's used in the King James, says, after many days, in verse 8, thou shalt be visited. Rotherham says, after many days, thou shalt muster thy forces. Here's the way the Septuagint reads. Septuagint says, he shall be prepared after many days, and he shall come at the end of years. In other words, this is a long period of preparation that goes into this. It's not something we should expect to happen within weeks or months. I think this means it's years, as the Septuagint says, of building up these forces and building them up in two ways, which we'll look at. Ezekiel 38, remember, talks about a confederacy of nations against Israel, both those near and those far. Two groups are mentioned there. Two groups. One is a warlike group, but another is a merchant people. Two motives, military and commercial. You know, when we say military, remember, wars are not fought in the same way as they were in the days of Ezekiel. So you've got to think about what we do today. In the last few weeks, I don't know if you remember about 2 or 3 weeks ago when the New York Times was taken down under a cyber attack. Terrorists are finally finding out how do you get to a country. You don't do it by running things into the World Trade Center. That's one way. But if you're a country and want to take down another country, the best way to do it, I'm not a computer expert, but those know that are, you attack them through their cyber networks. Everything we have is now tied into some kind of a network system. And in recent weeks, we've seen tremendous attacks. You know, Israel's recruiting for their army. And you know, the main people they're recruiting now are not necessarily those that are IDF forces. They're still getting those. But a lot of people that are cyber experts. And those are the ones they're seeking to come in through Aliyah. To have them come because this is the way countries are being attacked. Why is that important? I'm going to suggest a couple things here. Ezekiel 38:13, I'm going to go back to that Jewish version. Sheba and Dedan and all the leading merchants of Tarshish will ask you, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your hoards to loot, to carry off silver, gold, livestock, and other wealth? Now, in Ezekiel's days, that was how you measured wealth. It was through all the things you had. And if we look at that scenario of those that oppose Israel in the last days, you've got two blocks, an eastern block and a western block. It's that western block that are the spoilers that are mentioned there, those that come to take a spoil. Arabia, westernmost Europe, the former colonies, America, Australia, New Zealand. Sheba and Dedan are at the forefront, which again is at the head. But the important point is, remember, there's two elements here, a commercial element and then there's a military element. But even rethink that military element. So what we say in a global world of greed and economic chaos, it says one block is going to bide its time to glean the assets out of Israel. Now, I showed you that map with Israel's population and their land, and you say, what assets? It's a peanut country when you compare it to most others. What assets could you possibly want? They don't have the oil. They don't have other things. Well, what do they have that they're gaining more of every day? Those of you that have worked in business know, or have worked in any kind of a opportunity, where is the strength you have? Let's look at the Middle East economics. And this is the Global Competitive Index that's published each year. This is a 13 report. It ranks the competitiveness of 144 countries. And it looks at things like health, education, innovation, technology, what strength and market efficiency they have. Here's the ranking on that chart that I showed you before with the land. Here's the ranking of those countries by this index. Notice Israel is the highest ranked of any of those countries. Some of them aren't even ranked. Ranked 26. A gross domestic product, again, per capita, per person, of 31,000. The highest, even higher than the great Saudi Arabia. 26. Israel is ranked 26 out of 144 countries, and they're number 82 in the size of 192 countries in the world. Much higher. This is measured in U.S. dollars, by the way. So a great economic advantage accruing to a country that has to depend on themselves for almost everything. Let's take a survey of what's there, and I can suggest to you what assets people, that group of spoilers, will be after. The percentage of Israelis engaged in scientific and technological inquiry, the amount spent on research and development in relation to its production, its gross domestic product, is the highest in the world. Israel ranks fourth in the world in scientific activity, measured by the scientific publications per million of citizens. The total number of articles published worldwide is almost 10 times higher than its percentage of the world's population. Israel has the highest number of scientists, technicians, and engineers per capita in the world, 140 per 10,000 employees. If you look at the United States, we have 85 per 10,000. Japan, another great technological country, has 83. Not anywhere near the same. So what spoil will this group be after? Intangibles. Intellectual capital is recognized by most companies and most organizations as the biggest competitive advantage. You hear this every day where people say, our competitive advantage is our people. At the corporate level, it's those that's R&D, it's research and development, innovation, knowledge creation, all those things that are considered the most important determinants of performance. A book just published called The Knowledge and Wealth of Nations makes the same statement for countries. At the macroeconomic, remember, involves the broad picture. Microeconomics is based on the firm itself. Macroeconomics based on the global nature or the country's nature. At that level, new growth theories have been demonstrated the importance of knowledge in the performance of nations, that same sort of element. Here's Israel's rank in intellectual capital out of 125 countries. They ranked 5th in the growth of gross domestic product, 15 in competitiveness. Look at number 1 as education as a percent of gross domestic product. Scientists and engineers available to work on projects, number 1. Expenditures on research and development, number 1. Venture capital, new startup, number 2. Well, I've given you a lot to think about. Let's conclude. It wasn't my point to give you solutions, but just to point out to you there's a lot going on, and how do we make sense of it? God promises that Israel will enter into the kingdom as the earthly seed of Abraham. We read the promise in Genesis 22:17. That comes after the battles of Armageddon, the battles described in Ezekiel 38, Zechariah 14, Revelation 16. Today's events in the Middle East are setting up that scenario pretty clearly. I think more clearly than what we've seen before. We've never had this kind of turmoil in the Middle East. Jesus' kingdom that kingdom that you and I are striving for will be the first real opportunity for Israel not to be victimized by anti-Semitic feelings, but to bless all the people of the world. When you think about the scattering that took place over the last 3,000 years, it's allowed them uniquely to know almost every culture, every climate of every nation on earth. Israel as a nation must first go through a testing to redeem their heart. They've been regathered. They've been restored. Now their heart must be reclaimed. Part of that test I think they may go through will be an attempt by this bloc to brain drain that country. That was the biggest thing, the assets of the people are what they have. And think if these people, going up against Israel, the temptation will be to abandon and go back to those places where they would be welcomed, not hostilely, but welcomed back because of animosity that they left in the first place. Either military or economically, those going against Israel will go there, will have to finally submit to Jehovah God. Zechariah 14:16 says, "It shall come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." Zechariah 14:6 tells us this. So, brethren, as you think about these things, I'm only asking you to think about it, not take yourself away from the world's perspective on things and bring it back to the biblical perspective that I hope you've been able to share and implant in your minds today. And let us pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We know that difficult times have to come, but the peace of Jerusalem, when it does come, will mean the blessing of the whole world.